we are honored to invite Dr. Wang Jing as the young scientist lecturer for today's very interesting topic. Is electrifying the high efficiency future communities, impact on energy, emissions, and the grid. So she is a postdoctoral researcher at NREL, very famous institute worldwide. Her research is focused on applying the advanced modeling and the control techniques to help the communities to achieve flexibility, decarbonization, and the resilience. So that's very, very promising topic and area. So let's welcome her, leave the time to her. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. Can you see my first slide? Oh, sorry.
Yes, very clear.
Okay, yeah, let's get started. So today I'm very honored to be invited here to give this presentation to talk about a recently published paper on advances in applied energy. And the topic is electrifying high efficiency future communities, impact on energy emissions and grid. And here's a list of our co-authors. I'm the leading author, and the rest of the three authors are all from NREL. And a brief go through of the agenda today. First, I will provide the research background of this work, and then I will introduce the methodology we use in this paper. And we conducted a case study using the proposed methodology and share some main findings we got from the research, and lastly, some conclusion and also ongoing work that we are doing as a continuation of this work. So first, some general research background. First, to combat climate change and meet decarbonization goals, almost everything we do here at NREL is to combat climate change, apparently, because we are a renewable energy laboratory. And from the building sector perspective, we are, a lot of the buildings are trying to improve their energy efficiency and electrify their end users. This can reduce the carbon emissions from the fossil fuels. That's because our grid is becoming cleaner. So this figure on the left-hand side, yeah, sure. Feel free to share the link. Yeah, feel free to interrupt me during the presentation if you have any clarification questions. So here, this figure from EIA shows the annual energy outlook, and it shows that the renewable energy for all the electricity generation in the US, the renewable energy ratio is increasing by every year, and it's already 15% in year 2022, and it will continue to grow the next year to almost like 17%. So if our buildings becoming more dependent on the electricity grid, then the emissions from the electricity that are used by these buildings will become cleaner. Therefore, the emissions will get reduced. That's the whole idea behind this electrification of the building sector. So therefore, all electric buildings are becoming a trend among new constructions all over the world, not only in the US, but also I heard in the Europe and in China too. And this shows a table of the Denver, because NREL is located in Denver, Colorado. So I took these two tables from the Denver code. And this shows by code regulation in year 2027, almost all commercial building types need to be all electric. And also for the residential sector, it's also the same for multifamily buildings. So that shows really proves the trend of all electric buildings in the future. And this is the smaller background of this work, because this work is part of the AUMC project of NREL. So this AUMC project at NREL is to develop coordinated control of communities of buildings, fleet of autonomous vehicles, and intelligent infrastructures to maximize their operational value and contribute to the future grid. So in this project, we not only have the building part, building modeling and control part, and we also are going to model and control the electric vehicles, the so-called EVs. And the distribution network is also under consideration. Okay, the methodology of this work is pretty straightforward. The workflow we used to model this whole community and EV and the distributed energy resources follows this 4 steps. The first step is to, we took the community geographical information such as a map, and then we turn it into a GeoJSON file, which contains building information, including building footprint, building types, type of HVAC system, EV penetration at building level, and number of stories. Such information for each for the whole community into this GeoJSON file, and this file can be then read by UrbanOpt. UrbanOpt is another urban scale energy modeling tool developed by NREL, and UrbanOpt takes this GeoJSON file and it can do fast prototyping of the whole community, no matter how large it is. And then we get every energy models for this for every building in this community, and then we do annual simulation. And the next step, we use ReOpt, another tool developed by NREL. This tool uses optimization to size PV and batteries and other renewable energy resources such as wind and local generators, things like that. And it sizes based on your annual energy profiles for you. And it also provides optimal dispatching decisions based on your load profile. So the highlights in this workflow, first, it's pretty fast. The modeling and the energy simulation of any large communities can be really fast. And the core of UrbanOpt is utilizing DOE's prototypical building models. And the template is the ASHRAE 90.1 2019, which is the latest prototypical building model. And in terms of flexibility, what if you want to apply energy efficiency upgrades to your buildings to look at a future scenario, you can easily implement those through OpenStudio measures, because UrbanOpt is based on OpenStudio. And as I said, ReOpt does the optimal distributed energy resources sizing and annual dispatching for you. And also it has the capability to coordinate building loads with EV charging loads, because all of these loads are modeled in the same platform. So it's fairly easier to coordinate those loads based on your control needs. And this slide provides more details about how we model those DERs. First, PV, we first did use some tool to help us determine the optimal tilt and azimuth for the for the community location, which is Denver. And each building, we assume, because this community is not fully constructed yet, so we just use energy models to represent and help us forecast the community energy performance. So we assume each building is equipped with rooftop PV. And then we also assume community PV panels is added as needed to meet the net zero energy goals of the whole community. And the battery, we use REOPT to size the batteries, right? And REOPT is an mixed integer linear program, optimization program. It takes the inputs such as analysis goals, economic assumptions, policy-based incentives, utility rates, technology assumptions, and your building loads. And then it optimizes your system sizing and controls for the maximum financial value for you. And in terms of the EV load modeling, we varied the EV penetration at each building level. We assumed from 50% to 100% of EV penetration, meaning if it's 100%, meaning all the EVs parked at this building are all electric. There are no gasoline vehicles. And we also vary the charging behavior at each building. It can be either business as usual or free workplace charging. There are 3 different charging behaviors that's available. And we also scaled the EV load magnitude according to the building number of occupants. If the building has more occupants, then we assume there are more EVs. And this helps us create more realistic EV loads at the community level. And this figure shows the EV charging power for some selected buildings. And it can be as large as during work days this is mixed retail and restaurant building. It can be as large as over 400 kilowatts, the EV load. And for weekends, it can be smaller, but still for some buildings, it's pretty large. And this slide introduces the case study community that we modeled. This is a map of the 3D rendering map of the community located in Denver. And we have 10 different building types in this community. Most of them are large commercial buildings, and all the residential buildings are multifamily buildings. And in total, there are 148 buildings. And this community covers 382 acres of area, and it represents the future of real-world smart communities because it's all electric and it has all the advanced smart control systems. And the climate of this community is cold and dry, apparently, and it's a heating dominant area. And the HVAC systems include, because it's all electric, so the HVAC systems are powered by heat pumps and the VAV chiller systems with PFP boxes. Yes, I mentioned it's all electric, and it achieves net zero energy annually. It's annual energy, net zero energy. And we studied 5 different scenarios in this paper. First, we set up a baseline to represent the energy level in year 2020. And then on top of the baseline scenario, we applied some energy efficiency measures to represent a higher efficiency level in the year of 2030. This is measured by comparing the EUI values of this scenario to the code required values of Denver area in year 2030. So that's how we set up this future scenario for 2030. And this sets a baseline for the following scenarios. So on top of the scenario 2A, we further added more community PVs to the community and to help the community reach net zero. And then on top of scenario 2B, we added some EV loads to study the impact of large-scale EV adoption on the community energy performance, including peak demand, energy cost, and carbon emissions. In the last scenario, we further added battery to help shifting the loads and see how does that affect your energy performance. And here's a list of the EEMs we applied in the residential and the commercial. Mostly they are to increase the HVAC system efficiency, having better building envelope, having more efficient lighting and plug load systems, and decrease water usage, because there are not much water usage in commercial buildings, so we didn't include this for the commercial buildings. So that's about the scenario design for this paper. And for evaluation matrix in this paper, pretty standard evaluation matrix. First, we used net electricity usage intensity. Slightly different from the traditional EUI, we used electricity usage intensity, not energy usage intensity, because we don't have much natural gas usage in this community, so we just considered electricity. And it's net because we subtracted the PV generation from the total energy consumption to see a net EUI. And annual energy cost, it's net metered because here in the US, if you have local generation of PV and you don't use up that PV, you can actually export that excess PV amount back to the grid, and the grid will provide some incentive or money to you for exporting back and help make the grid cleaner. And that price it's pretty cheap. It's only about 1 cent per kilowatt hour, so it's not a lot, but we considered net metering. And peak demand as another evaluation matrix of how this community is impacting the grid at the distribution network level. And annual operational carbon emissions, we didn't consider embedded carbon emissions. We only considered the carbon emissions induced by the building consuming electricity from the grid. And it's calculated by multiplying your time varying carbon emission intensity from the grid with your time varying grid power and times your time step. And that adds up to your annual operational carbon emissions. And speaking of the time varying grid carbon intensity, traditionally in the building sector, when we evaluate carbon emissions from the buildings, we use an annual average value. Not many papers use the real-time grid carbon intensity values historically, but now more and more papers are starting to use the real-time data. So for this paper, we used the data from the Cambium data set. It's developed by Enroll again, and this data set provides the carbon intensity outlook for the future years by modeling the future US power grid, and it gives you hourly carbon intensity data of the grid, so you can know at which hour the grid is generating with which energy resources and how clean the electricity is from the grid. So we use that data, and we use 2020 data versus 2030 data for different scenarios. Comparing this to years, we can see that they are almost not very different, but we can see more for 2030 during the noon, because there are more PV in the daytime, we see that the values during the daytime are lower. And yeah, that's it. We don't see too much difference between the two. But this is before they updated the data set. Now with the new data set, maybe this difference might be larger. And another thing is that we didn't consider carbon net metering. That means for the PV power that you are exporting back to the grid, you don't obtain carbon emission offset due to that PV exporting. So that means even though you are obtaining money from the grid, but you are not obtaining emissions benefit from the grid because of that clean energy that you are exporting back. So that's just another assumption we made. So findings. The first finding, we looked at the net EUI values of the 5 proposed simulation scenarios. And when looking at this figure, the first thing we noticed is that the net EUI values in the future scenario, which is the purple boxes in this figure, we compared these values with the Denver code, and they align with those projected in the Denver's code. That means we did a great job matching those code and setting up this baseline for the other scenarios. And then for the future net zero energy scenario, which are the green boxes, they were designed to be net zero, and we see that from the green boxes that annual net zero energy are achieved. And in some building types, for instance, the multifamily, the retail, and the offices, and the schools, they are having negative net EUI values, meaning annually they are exporting more PV back to the grid than what they consume. And when looking at this figure on the right, we see that the blue lines and the yellow boxes overlap with each other. The blue boxes are basically hidden behind the yellow boxes. That's because the batteries only work as the temporal arbitrage, so they don't really affect the building energy consumption by too much. And lastly, when looking at this yellow and blue boxes, we see that adding EV load to the buildings will not only increase the building mean EUI values by a lot. In some buildings, it's a lot, and it also enlarges the range of the distribution of the EUIs. For clarification, we have 10 buildings in the community, and these plots are the mean values by building type. So if we see a larger range of the EUIs, that basically means for this building type, the EUI distribution is more scattered. That's because of the EUI is calculated related to building area. So for larger EV loads, if it's divided by different building area, the range will become really scattered. Yep, so next we looked at peak demand performances of this community. The first finding is that the adoption of the EEMs, when comparing the baseline and the future scenario where we only changed a few efficiency measures, we noticed that there's really only limited impact on the building's peak demand. That's because first, the baseline was already very energy efficient. So adding more efficiency measures to the buildings really didn't impact the peak demand by a lot. Another thing is that, let me see. Yeah, we didn't implement any control in the EEMs. For instance, we didn't do any load shifting in response to grid signals. So that's why we see very limited impact on peak demand. So based on that, we can say for highly efficient buildings, applying control-related measures such as load shifting will have higher impact on the building's peak demand than traditional energy efficiency upgrades. And secondly, comparing the future and future net zero energy scenarios, we noticed adding the ground PV panels in the future net zero energy scenario reduces peak demand, but not by a lot. In some buildings, it's really, we don't see too much peak demand reduction. So that's because when we plot the detailed power curve of each building, we see that the PV generation mainly is focused around noon, right? But for the large commercial buildings, the building peak occurs during the morning when people start to go to work, and but that just doesn't align with when the PV peaks. So that's why adding extra PV will offset a lot of energy consumption, but doesn't help reduce your peak demand by a lot. And that's the so-called very famous duck curve, if you know what I'm talking about. And the third finding is adding EV loads to the buildings increase the average monthly peak demand by 15 to 110 kilowatts. For a small building, 110 kilowatts peak demand can be a lot. So that will increase. So adding EVs to smaller buildings such as a home can be a lot because it's a really large energy consuming load. But compared to smaller buildings, large commercial buildings can be less impacted by those EV loads. And adding batteries has reduced the building peak demand by around 20% due to load shifting effects. And the annual carbon emissions, we generally see very similar trends across different scenarios and across different building types. So that is, we see 7 to 24% of emission reductions from the baseline to the future scenario. That's the two scenarios here. And then we see a larger reduction from the future net zero energy to the future, from the future scenario to the future net zero energy scenario. We see the most reduction. It can reach 40% for some building types. And let me see my notes. Yeah, that's from adding the PV panels from this scenario to this scenario. And yep. And then we for one building type, we see slightly a different trend. That's the multifamily building that I circled here. We see that adding EV loads, after adding EV loads, the total emissions exceeded that from the baseline scenario, which we didn't see in any of the other building types. And that's because in multifamily buildings, most people charge their EVs after they get back home during the night, right? And this plot shows the EV charging loads of the multifamily buildings, and we see that it peaks mostly power plants, or yeah, so it's less cleaner during the night, and that's when you charge your EVs. So that's why we see a jump on buildings. So with this, we can say when you charge your EV really matters in terms of carbon emissions. And in the energy bill, then the energy charge, and that's mostly true. That's mostly true for all American homes, because demand charge has a higher rate than energy charge. And we see limited peak shaving effect of extra PV panels again. So that's because, yeah, the the disalignment between the PV generation and when the peak happens. So adding PV panels didn't help reduce your peak demand charge. And lastly, when we look at the PV credits each building are obtaining, so although those large commercial buildings are exporting a lot back to the grid, but the PV credits they obtain cannot cancel out the energy charge under the current local utility rate structure. So that means a longer payback period for adding PV panels to your building, at least under the current utility rate structure. And the last 4 to 5 slides, we are looking at the energy performance of each building type. Now we take a look at the community aggregated performance. This figure shows the community annual energy consumption compared between the baseline and the future net zero energy plus EV plus battery. And this shows the annual carbon emissions distribution among building types. So when we look at this figure, we see that after adding the EVs and batteries, the multifamily building, the light green one, becomes the top energy consumer in the community. That's because the EV loads affected the residential buildings' energy consumption more than other larger commercial buildings. So when other buildings are utilizing that extra PV to help balance their loads, residential buildings didn't, because the EV loads are too large, they cannot cancel out those EV loads using the PV panels, limited PV panels. That's why they became the largest energy consumption in this future net zero energy plus EV and battery scenario. But when we take a look at the carbon emissions distribution, we see that the two pie charts are almost the same. So the same distribution is seen in the baseline and the future net zero and EV and battery scenario. That's because, as we mentioned before, we didn't enable carbon net metering in the future net zero energy community scenario. So those large commercial buildings will lose that benefit from exporting back PV. So that's why the largest emissioner in the baseline is still the largest emissioner in the final scenario. So enabling carbon net metering can further reward energy prosumers, especially those large commercial buildings with large EV loads. And to conclude this study, we demonstrated a streamlined workflow for modeling large mixed-use all-electric communities. And we conducted an in-depth impact analysis of EEMs and DER adoption in future all-electric communities. And we see that overnight EV charging activities and higher grid carbon intensities at night has led to carbon emissions increase in multifamily buildings. And lastly, the addition of batteries helped reduce the peak demand by between 11% to 29% among different building types. And I have one more slide. This was not included in the journal article, but this is our ongoing work, and this has recently been published in the ACEEE conference. So I wanted to introduce some about this ongoing work. Sorry, that's my dog. So in this work, we did carbon responsive EV. Okay. Okay. 建筑能源系统净零排放说的是 net zero emissions 对吗？然后
应该是
对，首先这个是一个新的概念，就是净零排放。我们一直其实之前说的是净能耗，就是 net zero energy，但是最近几年就开始出现净零排放的这个概念。首先，我觉得净零排放是比净那个零能耗是更难的一个概念，因为你只要用电网的电，只要电网的电不是零能耗，那么你就有零排放，那么你就有那个排放的。那么首先第一个就是电网的电要变得越来越清洁。我自己的理解啊，就是它电网的就是煤炭的更少 natural energy， 更多的会有那些 renewable energy， 还有水厂啊这些的 nuclear 这些的。然后，那么你建筑用电的时候就会减少它的排放，至少是 operational emissions。另外一个就是增加你的 local 的 generation，local 的 clean generation， 比如说增加 PV panels， 增加那个可以是小区级别的那种风能啊，或者是还有就是用 battery 储存干净的能源在白天，然后晚上的时候你也可以用那些干净的能源。然后还有就是可以有更多的 smart controller， 然后去帮助你把你的用电从 high intensity 的时刻 shift 到 low emission intensity 的时刻，这些结合。或者还有就是你比如像电网售电，你可以获得相应的回报来 offset 你的 annual emissions。当然这个目前还没有，反正据我所知还没有就是实现。但是我觉得在 future 应该可以有一个方法，就是说你像电网售电，你可以获得一定的 carbon credit 来 cancel out 你的 annual emission。对，这是我自己的理解。建模时 net zero emission 如何体现在目标函数或约束条件中？所以你说的应该是在优化问题中怎么实现 net zero emission。如果你是做一个优化问题，首先目前我做了一些 carbon driven control， 基本上还是停留在 rule base。但是其实你如果做 optimization based 也不难，我觉得跟那个 price driven 是一个道理。你就把你的，我前面有一个公式，OK， 这个是你的 annual operational emission。那么你的目标是让它变成零，对吗？变成零的话，你就是，OK， 一部分是 P grade。对，如果你的 P grade 是零，那么这个 annually 它就一定是零。就是说你完全不依赖电网的话，你全都用 local 的清洁能源，那么你就能实现这个。就是把这个可以直接加到你的目标函数里面，那么你的优化就可以。如果是约束条件的话，我还没有想好。我感觉加在目标函数里可能更 make sense 一点。对，从 utility grid 买电和向 grid 售电的碳排放如何考虑？对 ，utility grid 买电的排放就是通过这一项 ETCO2 嘛，它是 grid carbon intensity， 它是一个 input data， 你可以直接 input 到你的，通过一个 CSV 或者是一个 Excel table， 它是已知的，你直接 input 到你的那个目标函数里面。那么它是一个 hourly 或者是 sub hourly change 的一个东西，然后加到你的那个目标函数里面。那么当你买电的时候，你的 P grid 大于零的时候，你就这一项就是正的。向 grid 售电的话，碳排放，对， 那就是 carbon net metering 考不考虑的问题。如果你不考虑，那么你即使你的 P grade 是负的，当你 P grade 是负的时候，这一项就会是0，因为你不考虑那个carbon net metering。如果你考虑的话，那么就是说你会获得一些负的 carbon emissions 在你的那个目标函数里面。但如果是不考虑 carbon net metering，那么你的这个问题就会变得 non-convex， 因为你还需要加个条件，就是 P grade 小于0的时候，这一项要变成0，它就不太连续了，就叠起来可能会比较麻烦。但是 anyway 大概就是这样考虑。我目前做的还都是停留在 rule base， 但是我们有些同事在做那个optimization base， 跟那个 price driven 的 optimization 其实是挺像的。相关数据，比如电量消耗、家庭人口规模、电动车辆数据预测 ，OK。电量消耗 ，OK， 你就说的是 low profile。对 ，low profile 我们是通过那个 Open Studio 模拟出来的。但是它就是通过，首先尽量你的模型要贴近实际，然后我们 assume 你的 input 是准的，那么然后 assume 你的 assumption 是准，那么你就会有一个 forecast of annual simulations or like hourly load profile of each building, right? 我们用的这个 Urban Op Tool， 它的核心其实就是 Open Studio， 然后我们用了 Open Studio 的 prototypical buildings。And Open Studio 它的核心其实就是 Energy Plus。对。
Is it the open tool from a real
Yes.
or open?
It's open
Okay.
source. I think you can find it on the internet. Yeah. 家庭人口规模。对，这个是我们用了 default value of prototypical building， 所以我们也没有去改变它那个每个建筑里面的人口。电动车辆，对 EV 的数据 OK，good question。EV 的数据我们是 based on 我们之前的 colleagues 的 work， 他们是用了一个 tool 叫 EVI Pro。EVI Pro 应该也是 open source 的吧？我觉得它是一个 dynamic 的 modeling 的 tool， 它就是模拟每一个车的 arrival、charging， 然后 departure 这些，它是 stochastically 的一个 modeling 的 tool， 就是它会根据你的，我没有用过，但是根据我听说的，就是它那个模拟，根据一些 probability distribution， 然后模拟这个车什么时候 arrive， 它会在这里待多久，然后什么时候 depart， 然后它到的时候，它的 initial state of charge 是多少，然后它的 charging power 是多少，这样，然后做一个 stochastic 的 simulation， 然后再把它们 aggregate 到一起，然后就可以知道每个建筑，根据它的楼，对，那个 tool 叫 EVI Pro， 我给它打在这里。其实自己要做这个模拟，我觉得也不难。首先就是你做一个 stochastic 的模型，然后从文献里面可以找一些 distribution 来预测这 EV 它啥时候到啊，然后它最初始的 SOC 是什么，然后它待多久，对，反正就是一个 stochastic 的方法去预测。对。OK，然后我说一下 我这儿还没有说完，快速说一下，就是我们做了一个 carbon responsive 的 EV control， 就是来 shift EV load based on grid carbon intensity. So the idea is that we charge the EVs more when the grid is cleaner, and we charge less when the grid is less clean. And we tried different, because it's rule-based, we tried different sets of thresholds. So these thresholds are like when the intensity is above 60 is unclean, then 60% of the data points, then it's considered unclean. When it's below 40%, then it's clean, and between them it's default. And we tried to include or not include compensation before departure. That means whether or not to compensate for your EV curtailment during the last 2 hours of before your EV departure. And the last variable is that we tried to include or not include the charging power limits of a EV. When we don't consider charging power limits, we assume it can charge as much as it wants. But apparently this is not realistic because the charging power is limited by your charger power. So, but that's just those scenarios are just for theoretical analysis. And in this scenario, we included a charging power limit. And some observations. So first, in the controller 1 and 2, we saw actually emissions increase than not implementing any control. So that's not what we want, right? That's because we had this compensation before EV departure, and during that last 2 hours before EV departure, you are charging a lot. Actually, that means you are shifting your EV load to those 2 hours, but those 2 hours can be, the grid power can be really not clean. So that's why we're seeing this emissions increase, and those are not good controllers. And in controllers 3 and 4, we didn't include last minute EV charging compensation, and we finally saw some EV emission reductions. And another thing is that we see that the need for a fully charged EV battery can lead to emissions increase. That's for these 2 scenarios, we had the EVs leaving with a full battery. But for these 2 scenarios, when we looked at the state of charge, we see they might not have a full battery. They might have like the battery charged to 85% or 90%, which can be enough for you to like go home to conduct your everyday activities. But a sacrificing of up to 15% of SOC can reduce carbon emissions by up to 12.7% while meeting the commute needs. So that's why some like charging companies or like are encouraging people not to charge to a full battery, but to charge to like 80-90%. That can not only like save your money and but can also have positive environmental impact. And in this figure, we show a almost linear relationship between the carbon emissions reductions and the EV SOC at departure, as I said. So the higher the lower, of course, the lower the SOC, the higher the carbon emissions reductions because you are charging less, right? And limiting the EV charging power in controller 4 can mitigate the potential higher peak demand caused by the charging events, because we're seeing higher peaks in those controllers when we didn't have a power limit. induced by the load shifting. Yeah, that's it. That's all I have today. I'm open to any further questions.
Okay, thank you very much. I think Dr. Wang draw a very broad, detailed and very practical picture for the future carbon net zero carbon emission picture, something. I think it's very interesting and very good work. For the time's sake, maybe one or two questions. So please just show me or just raise your question on the text box. Or if you like, you can just 说中文。No, OK， 那就是干脆给我留一个机会提一个问题吧。就是我觉得这个请教一下，我觉得一个就是说，这是一个非常非常就是那个实际的这样的一个case，里面有非常多有意思的这个数据，比如说不同的建筑条件之下，它的应该说是这个可以去达到这个net zero 的这么一个 potential 吧。包括就是说我加了 EV 加了 PV 之后，到底都有多少的这个可以这个去操作的这个量。但我不知道现在在美国或者说就是咱们这个 case 来讲，当下有多少的 PV 要达到这样的一个，就是按照这个 case 来讲的话，我们这个 PV 得要达到这个多少的这个量才可以能支撑这么好的一个结果。另外就是说目前的这个结果来看的话，就是说包括这个里面还说到了这个 battery 这件事情，就是美国从政府或者从地区政府来看的话，对 battery 这件事情是持一个什么样的一个态度，因为它的这个影响也是比较大的，但是同时在各个国家都还是存在有争议的，包括它的这个economic 的问题，还是这个安全的问题。所以请教一个可能 detail 一点，一个 general 一点。
好，第一个问题就是PV 的问题。对，确实，其实在 baseline 的 scenario 就是我们 assume 是只有75%的 rooftop 是 covered by PV， 它其实只能supply 你的 load 的5%以内的。就是说，如果要真的达到 net zero energy， 我们其实是后期加了很多的，我们 assume有这个条件，有这个地方，其实就是地方也是很重要的。你
是的，
有那个地方去装那么多的 PV panel 的话，我们算了一下，如果要达到 net zero energy， 你即使把这个 community 它占的那么多的 acre 全部占满，它也是不能达到 net zero energy 的。所以这个是一个非常理想化的情况，就是加了非常多的 PV， 我只能说，但是为了做这个研究嘛，我们就assume 它能达到 net zero energy， 但是对，确实，这个在现实生活中的话，可能在 residential sector 更容易一些，就是 rooftop PV，你装那么几块 PV 板，它可能就能 supply 你大部分的那个，就是说你的用电，但是对于大型的商业建筑来说，就杯水车薪。对。
Denver 还是一个太阳能资源比较好的地方，是吧？
对对，非常好，就是
科罗拉多州嘛，
还有风能资源，还有太阳能资源，所以这是为什么这个NREL 在这个地方建那个 site。对，对。第二个问题是，您能再重复一下吗？关于 battery 的。
那个就是关于 battery， 就是说是美国整个政府或者说是地区，它是持一个什么样的态度？是一个这个积极，还是打算要走大规模的这个路线，还是说什么样的一个方针？
这个我不是专家，但是我只能说一些我的了解吧。 首先就是 home battery 的话，首先有2种 scale， 一种是 grid scale 的那种 battery， 就是像我们 NRO 在研究的有那种，就是它装在非常大，装在那个电网上提供那种 ancillary services 的那种 battery， 那是一个级别的。然后民用的话，就是有一些，比如特斯拉啊这种，就是这种商用的这种厂吧，它会提供一些
battery
incentive，
wall 或者叫什么是吧？
对，它会提供一些
OK
incentive 去想办法去卖这个，但是我觉得它的市场普及率应该还是不高的吧，就是然后政府比如说Denver 的 government， 他们也会提供一些叫 rebate 的那种 program， 比如说去鼓励你装一个 battery， 我们给你$2000，这样子就减小你的出投资，然后去鼓励民众去装 battery， 但是我感觉现在普及率还是不高。然后就是那种大规模的 grid scale 的 battery， 我觉得现在可能还停留在 research 阶段，就是还没有到，或者在试点阶段，我不是特别了解，但是还没有到真的就是说大规模应用的阶段。还有的话就是还有一个比较多的就是 community scale， 比如说一个小区装一些 battery， 这个的话我们组研究的也比较多，也是停留在 research 阶段，就是 research 已经走得非常前面了，怎么用 optimization 去 dispatch 这个 battery 啊，怎么跟 PV 配合呀什么的，怎么跟 load 配合。但是我感觉可能会有一些 smart community 的试点项目，就科罗拉多，对我们组的另外一个博士叫金星，他之前做了一个 smart community 的项目，就是在科州的一个 community， 一个 residential 的 community， 他们是有装一些 battery， 然后他们也尝试了用那个smart home controller 去控制 battery 去，对，就是有一些试点项目，对，大概是这样子，
Okay, thank you. I think we have we are good control. Time controller is just 10 a.m. 10 o'clock. So okay. At the end, I hope to thank you, Dr. Wang, for the very excellent presentation for us. Especially, I think it's very evening in US. So for this time to give us this wonderful presentation, I hope to say thank you. And more importantly, I hope to thank you all, the audience today. Thank you very much. So see you for the next time. So it's a serious presentation, energy vision. So welcome for the next time. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.